Um escravo do Haiti que trabalhava como cabeleireiro. Uma americana que fizera um aborto. Um arcebispo de El Salvador que se envolveu na política. Para alguns, todos eles já são santos. Mas que será necessário para que a Igreja Católica Romana também os considere como tal? Fica situado na margem ocidental do rio Tibre, nos arredores de Roma, uma espécie de principado religioso com as suas próprias leis e governo e a responsabilidade de administrar os assuntos da Igreja Católica Romana. Chama-se Vaticano e é lá que são tratadas as questões da Igreja, desde as encíclicas papais à nomeação de clérigos de todo o mundo. Também é lá que os santos são canonizados. E no Vaticano, isso não acontece num dia. Atualmente, uma canonização oficial só se concretiza após um processo que se arrasta por bastante tempo. Uma investigação à vida de um candidato que pode demorar dezenas de anos, quando não séculos.
Il s'agit d'une femme toute simple, avec une vie ordinaire, en qui
há que fazer perguntas e obter respostas. Que tipo de pessoa era o candidato? Alguma vez escreveu algo contrário à doutrina da Igreja? Os milagres que lhe são atribuídos serão mesmo milagres ou qualquer outra coisa? Quando se trata de canonização, a Igreja tem critérios muito rigorosos. O padre Peter Gampel é o relator da Congregação para as Causas dos Santos.
We have a system that may still be perfected, and probably will be perfected, but it's very strict and very severe indeed, and that's necessary.
Consideremos o caso do cabeleireiro haitiano Pierre Toussaint, que morreu há quase 200 anos. Em novembro de 1990, a Igreja Católica de Nova Iorque levou a cabo uma estranha escavação no cemitério da antiga Igreja de São Patrício. Procuravam o corpo de um homem que nasceu escravo e foi sepultado aqui há quase 150 anos, um homem que um dia poderá ser santo. Pierre Toussaint tinha 21 anos quando veio do Haiti para Nova Iorque com os seus senhores. Estava-se em 1787, 70 anos antes da abolição da escravatura.
When the Barad family came to New York, the family that owned him, Mr. Barad knew that there was a possibility he'd lose all his money back in Haiti and all his property. So in his concern for Pierre, he asked him to learn a trade. So he arranged for him to be an apprentice hairdresser. And he learned the trade and learned it so well that he got to be in demand by all the rich people of this area and had a good income.
Toussaint tornou-se uma espécie de confidente espiritual das mulheres ricas, cujo cabelo empoava e tratava. Solicitava-lhes regularmente contributos para o orfanato católico de Nova Iorque. Ironicamente, este orfanato só aceitava crianças brancas. Numa época em que as epidemias mortais ocorriam com frequência, cuidava dos doentes.
Another indication of his sanctity, I think, is his willingness to go to help people who were diseased. For example, they had the yellow fever plagues, the cholera plagues. And in those days, they didn't have any medication to help them, so they just put them in a building, close the building, put barricades around it, and just say, well, they're in there, they're diseased, let them die. And Pierre saw this and said, that's not Christian. He said, I think, is a tremendous thing in his favor as a saint, that without any immunization from any kind of medication at that time, he was willing to go in there to try to help these people, knowing that it could be possible that he would contract one of the diseases himself and die.
Depois, o Sr. Barnard morreu, deixando a esposa sem dinheiro, e Toussaint encarregou-se do seu sustento. Durante 20 anos, colocou comida na mesa da mulher que era legalmente sua dona, pagou-lhe as contas e, envergando a farda carmesim, servia comes e bebes nas suas reuniões sociais. Com prova de gratidão, a Sra. Barnard, pouco antes de morrer, deu a Toussaint a liberdade. Meu querido Toussaint, disse ela, tens sido tudo para mim. Não existe remuneração terrena para tais serviços. Apesar da escravatura de Toussaint ter terminado em 1807, o mesmo não aconteceu ao desejo de servir os outros, nem ao empenho que toda a vida demonstrou pela sua fé.
Right now we're in St. Peter's Church on Barclay Street in Lower Manhattan, and this is the church that Pierre Toussaint attended every day, weekdays, Saturdays, Sundays, for over 60 years. It's recorded that he could be seen in the wintertime in the darkness, walking here, in summertime in the warm weather, but was here every day. That was part of his routine to start the day, to spiritually energize himself.
Nos anos decorridos desde a exumação dos restos mortais de Toussaint, o movimento pela sua canonização tem vindo a ganhar força. O seu corpo encontra-se agora na Catedral de São Patrício em lugar de honra. Rezam pela sua canonização e eventual intercessão na doença de alguém. Isto porque a Igreja exige que ao santo sejam atribuídos 2 milagres de cura, e até agora Toussaint não tem nenhum.
We have many letters of people who say that they feel that it was through Pierre's intercession that they were healed, but these we have to declare as favors because all of these people have had some other kind of medical treatment, so that rules out a miracle as far as the church is concerned.
Se esses milagres se concretizarem, os apoiantes de Toussaint estão otimistas quanto à possibilidade de ele ser canonizado.
He'll make it. Timing, everything. New York, American, Haitian, black, a slave who threw away slavery. He's a comer. He has a very good chance. And no political involvement, you see. Rome likes slaves who gives money to their owners, you know. That just reeks of forgiveness. And I don't mean that cynically now. There's something to be said there.
He satisfies two goals of the papacy when it comes to saint-making. One is he provides a country that does not have a Catholic saint with one, namely Haiti. And secondly, he supplies a group in the United States that is important but does not have one, namely the black or the African-American community, never mind these from Haiti and so forth.
Here's a man who had every reason to cop out. He was a slave, a black man, at a time when their opinion really was sought for nothing. And he could easily have said, well, who will listen to me? I'm a black man, I'm a slave. But he did not cop out. He first of all realized that before God he had dignity. And I think that's why he came to Mass here every day. First of all, to cement that relationship between himself and God, to grow spiritually. That was important. He realized he had value in God's sight.
Mas não são os apoiantes de Toussaint que vão decidir se ele vai ser declarado santo. Isso cabe à Igreja. O Papa João Paulo II tem proclamado mais santos que a maioria dos seus antecessores neste século.
Joseph Maria Escrivá de Balaguer.
Mas ninguém no Vaticano quer que o processo de canonização seja fácil.
We prefer rather to be too strict than not strict enough. Because it would be disastrous, and so far it hasn't happened, that later on things are found that we didn't discover, and then, well, there would be a scandal, there would be a criticism, and that we want to avoid this as far as we can.
Por isso, a Igreja age com prudência. E a causa de um alcoólico irlandês regenerado não constitui exceção. Em Dublin, na Irlanda, separado de Pierre Toussaint pelo Atlântico, outro homem percorre o caminho para a santidade, ainda que um pouco mais lentamente. Chama-se Matt Talbot. Irlandês de uma zona pobre de Dublin, Talbot morreu em 1925 com 71 anos. Quando os médicos o despiram no hospital, descobriram que usava correntes junto ao corpo. Jamais alguém vira uma coisa assim.
I'm quite sure if Matt knew he was going to die that day, those chains would have been off. But I believe that they served a purpose. That when it was discovered that these chains were on his body, people began to ask, who are we dealing with? Are we dealing with someone who is very special or someone who's not so special, you know? And then they began to ask questions. If he died with those chains, Matt would have been buried and forgotten about, because no one would have been made aware of his life.
Como veio depois a saber-se, a vida de Matt Talbot era a história do triunfo sobre o alcoolismo. Usava as correntes como penitência e para lhe lembrar que não devia ceder aos desejos de prazer do corpo. Quando Matt Talbot começou a frequentar a igreja, não era um homem religioso, mas simplesmente alguém que decidira que após 12 anos de vício era a altura de parar. Ia à missa todas as manhãs apenas para fazer algo que o ajudasse a manter-se sóbrio. A pouco e pouco, segundo a história, foi trocando a companhia dos colegas de bebida pela de Deus e modificando completamente a sua vida. A irmã descreveu-o assim: quando jovem, Matt vivia para a bebida. Já idoso, vivia para Deus. Talbot dedicava-se ainda a ajudar os outros a libertarem-se do vício do álcool. Hoje, na Irlanda e Estados Unidos, dezenas de centros Matt Talbot continuam a sua obra. Os que desejam a canonização de Talbot chamam a atenção para o facto de ele constituir um exemplo magnífico para todos aqueles que pretendam mudar de vida.
Here is a guy that felt the pain of what it was like to be an addict, that knew what it was to get up in the morning and look for a daily fix, that knew what damage it does not only to your own person but to your family and your friends. You're in an area here where Matt walked and worked and drank and prayed. And in this area now, in the 1990s, it's raked with drugs and addiction of various kinds. And I would see his presence here in this church as a light in a very dark and confused world to say, hey, you know, sobriety is possible. That drugs is not the end.
Mas bastarão as boas obras de Matt Talbot para fazer dele um santo? Uma vez mais, é uma questão que cabe ao Vaticano decidir.
His cause is far advanced, but we are still waiting for a miracle which so far doesn't seem to be forthcoming. You know that he was a dock worker, a rather kind of rough kind of man, and also given to drinking, giving also to swearing and all that. And gradually, moved by the grace of God, he led a completely different life. And I think that's an example because there may be people who have had similar problems, and it is very difficult for them to get rid of these less good habits, so to say, and that requires courage, it requires an effort, and to propose people like that as an example is, to my opinion, very important, because then people could say, well, we have been living that, it's not hopeless for us.
There are miracles happening every day in the whole area of addiction when people who can change their lifestyle from one which is one of hell to a lifestyle that has a bit of hope and healing and decency in it. If that's not a moral miracle, I don't know what is.
Matt's in trouble. He often went to Mass about 6 times a day, which when I was a kid was considered a virtue. Today it's considered a bit over the edge. He wore hair shirts and sometimes chains around his body by way of penance. Today that's considered well over the edge.
Who can prove you're a saint? You know, a saint is a very ordinary person who has a very close relationship with God. And I believe God in his own way will motivate and inspire those in authority to say, give this guy a chance, he deserves it. Give him a break, make him a saint. Because there's a lot of people he is helping.
Mesmo na Irlanda, no meio em que viveu Matt Talbot, são muitos os que duvidam da sua santidade.
Well, a woman came to me one day and she said to me, she said, Father Costello, Matt Talbot could not be a saint. It just stressed me a bit. I hoped you might be. And I said, why not? She said, because I knew him, Father, and he didn't look like one. He didn't look like St. Patrick. He didn't look like St. Francis. So I said to her, well, what did he look like? And she gave, I think, a wonderful answer. She thought and she said, he looked like one of us, the poor of Dublin. In fact, she hit the nail on the head. You know, the God's own poor. He was one of them.
Mas a canonização nem sempre foi tão complicada quanto hoje. No decorrer dos séculos, a forma de alguém ser declarado santo foi sofrendo mudanças, por vezes drásticas. Há 2000 anos, para ser santo, bastava morrer. O primeiro registro que temos de pessoas a reunirem-se para prestar culto a um santo foi no ano 155 d.C., a São Policarpo de Esmirna. Após uma longa vida de serviço ao seu cada vez maior rebanho de fiéis, Policarpo foi denunciado como cristão e obrigado pela multidão pagã a blasfemar contra Cristo ou morrer. Quando recusou, foi queimado vivo. Os primeiros cristãos registaram cuidadosamente a história do seu julgamento e martírio, mas depois fizeram algo ainda mais significativo. Recolheram os ossos dele e esconderam-nos. O local escolhido para os guardarem foi o altar, centro da celebração do culto. Até muito recentemente, todos os altares tinham relíquias de um santo, tornando esse espaço sagrado. Quando os discípulos de Policarpo começaram a venerar os seus ossos, surgiu o primeiro exemplo de um mártir que se tornou objeto de um culto local. Policarpo era considerado tão virtuoso e influente que se acreditava que até pedacinhos dele tinham o poder de interceder junto de Deus. Na verdade, na ideia dos primeiros cristãos, os ossos, cabeça, braço ou qualquer outra parte de um santo conseguiam operar milagres.
A relic, some bit from the body of a saint, usually a piece of bone or maybe the entire body, was seen to be the reservoir of the saint's power. Now, saints were important in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period because they were protectors. It was a saint who protected a community from dangers over the upcoming year. But if you wanted that protection, it was especially wise to have a relic of the saint in your community.
Santo podia garantir uma colheita abundante, pôr fim a surto de peste ou curar uma deformidade. O mesmo tipo de coisas que os deuses pagãos conseguiam fazer, só que ainda melhor. Não tardou muito a que cada comunidade cristã começasse a acumular as relíquias dos seus mártires e a transmitir as histórias dos seus feitos heroicos às gerações vindouras. Assim começou o processo de canonização. Por volta do século IV, o cristianismo dominava o Império Romano. Ano após ano, missionários cristãos levavam a sua fé a regiões cada vez mais remotas. À medida que as tribos pagãs se iam convertendo, estes novos cristãos queriam ter os seus próprios santos, ou pelo menos um pedaço de um, principalmente porque atraíam peregrinos e dinheiro à comunidade. Não é de admirar que a procura de relíquias aumentasse. O resultado foi um negócio próspero de partes de corpos de santos, algumas autênticas, outras um pouco mais duvidosas.
In the late 14th century, an Italian writer named Franco Sacchetti wrote a series of what we would today call short stories. And in one of those short stories, he tells the story of Taddeo Dini, a Dominican who was invited to preach at a convent dedicated to St. Caterina. Dini gives his sermon, and the sacristans bring him a relic. It's the arm of St. Caterina, and they want him to display it to the crowd. Well, Dini is skeptical. He says, wait a minute, he says, I've been to the shrine of St. Caterina on Mount Sinai, and I've seen her body, and it has two arms. This can't be the arm of St. Caterina. And they say, no, it is the arm. So eventually, Dini gets up on the pulpit and he says to the people, he says, look, the people here say that this is the arm of St. Caterina. Now, I've seen the body of St. Caterina, and she has two arms. But if she had a third arm, I'm sure that this was it.
Uma das formas mais fáceis de adquirir a relíquia de um santo era simplesmente declarar que uma pessoa respeitada da região recentemente falecida era santa. Os seus ossos podiam não ter o mesmo poder dos de um mártir, mas eram melhores que nada. Pouco depois, o Vaticano começou a ficar preocupado com o facto dos clérigos locais não terem competência para determinar se uma pessoa com um culto popular era realmente um santo.
Some bishops proceeded to the canonization of people without having done the necessary search, and then later it turned out that matters were very different from what I had thought. I'll give you a concrete example. In Sweden, for example, a man was declared a martyr, but later it turned out that he had just been killed by ordinary robbers. Well, he didn't die for the faith at all.
There were new saints, new martyrs, and there was no quality control on all of these. And so for a time, it appeared that there was a real threat that Christianity would develop into a Hinduism of the West, with a multiplicity of saints, and therefore of people who could be prayed to, and people would ask for intercession and so forth. And so there had to be some kind of quality control.
O problema atingiu um ponto crítico em meados do século XII. Um monge, conhecido por gostar da bebida, meteu-se numa rixa de bêbados, da qual resultou a sua morte. Mas apesar dos seus excessos, o monge tinha admiradores e depois da sua morte foi declarado santo pelo povo da terra. Para o Vaticano foi a gota d'água. Apesar dos protestos dos apoiantes do monge, o Papa Alexandre III revogou-lhe o estatuto de santo.
The local process had gotten out of hand. Local saints were canonized all too freely and frequently by the local bishop who was terrified of angering his people, many of whom came to the Palazzo or to the church and stood in the big piazza outside, made so much noise that insisted, you know, before they started throwing rocks, that they better canonize old Beppo, and so they did, you know. And then Rome finally said, enough.
A canonização era feita sem qualquer controlo. Chegar à altura de tomar uma atitude. Era necessário estabelecer normas sobre quem podia ou não ser santo. Durante séculos, fora do consenso geral que os requisitos para a canonização incluíssem provas consistentes de milagres, assim como as chamadas virtudes heroicas, uma vida de bondade, muito para além da exigida ao católico comum. Mas a quem cabia decidir se um candidato era heroicamente virtuoso ou um milagre verdadeiro? Como o caso do monge amigo da bebida sugeriu, não se podia confiar nas autoridades locais. Finalmente, em 1234, o controlo local sobre a canonização foi oficialmente retirado quando o Papa Gregório IX avocou a Roma jurisdição absoluta sobre o processo. E ficou assim. No Vaticano, nascia um sistema de complexidade legal e burocracia perfeitamente absurdas. A partir de então, o caminho para a santidade seria pavimentado com normas processuais. No decorrer dos séculos seguintes, este processo legal foi alargado, transformado e calcificado numa espécie de julgamento longo e minucioso. Englobava advogados, escriturários e um promotor cuja função era apresentar argumentos contra a canonização proposta, o chamado advogado do diabo.
You had lawyers who were advocates for the cause against lawyers, or the devil's advocate's office, lawyers for the church. And they would look at the material, and they would argue back and forth, and they were required to meet at least 3 times. And sometimes these would go on for decades. And a lot of times they were, as one of the officials of the congregation said, it was like throwing spitballs back and forth.
Com o decorrer do tempo foram regulamentados outros aspectos da canonização. Chegou-se a acordo quanto ao número de milagres, 1 para o mártir, 2 para todos os outros tipos de santos. Estabeleceram-se ainda as várias fases que a constituem.
In terms of the Vatican process, there are basically 4 stages to the road to becoming a saint. The first is called servant of God. That's when someone's cause has been accepted by Rome. They call them a servant of God. Then when they have proven that the person has had the required virtues to an heroic degree, they're called venerable. Then when a venerable has had a miracle of intercession attributed to him or her, they are called blessed. And then the final stage, after a second miracle has been attributed to the person, or then they become a saint of the universal church.
Desde o início que a Igreja demonstrou não ter pressa em fazer canonizações. Era habitual esperar pelo menos 15 anos até uma causa ser aceite, estendendo-se por vezes esse prazo a mais 50 ou 100 anos. Terminara a época do santo local, amado, místico e protetor. Em vez disso, a burocracia papal de Roma, pouco liberal, começou a canonizar uma sucessão de papas, cardeais, arcebispos e uma multidão de outros clérigos desconhecidos. Durante cerca de 800 anos, o complicado processo de canonização não sofreu alterações. Até que uma vez mais Roma decidiu que não estava a resultar. Em breve ocorreriam algumas mudanças. No dia 25 de janeiro de 1983, o Papa João Paulo II determinou uma revisão quase total do sistema de canonização. O objetivo era simplificar e atualizar o processo.
There have been many reforms. On the one hand, simplifying the procedure. On the other hand, insisting more and more consistently on the use of other sciences like history, psychology, sociology, all the human sciences, because we want to make use of all the means that human industry and human science can put at our disposal.
So in 1983, they said, look, well, this should be done on a different model, the model of the doctoral dissertation. We need history. We're always looking backwards. So many of the causes were being thrown back into the hopper because while the lawyers were arguing over things, they didn't really have an historical understanding of this person. And so the historians, to make a long story short, won out over the lawyers. The lawyers were thrown out.
Mas esta nova abordagem histórica não era menos exigente e morosa que a anterior. Quando se trata de pesquisar a vida e época de um santo, há muito material a considerar. Isto é apenas uma pequena parte da informação recolhida através dos séculos por um pequeno grupo de estudiosos chamados bolandistas. Desde o início do século XVII que pesquisam a vida dos santos, o estudo mais prolongado da história ocidental. Nunca em grupos superiores a 6 pessoas, a missão dos bolandistas consiste em elaborar histórias precisas e exaustivas da vida dos santos.
In general, I would say that the work of the Bollandist is studying everything which is linked with the lives of saints from a historical point of view.
We try to collect together copies of all the existent manuscripts of one text about one saint. What we can really say about the saint in question, what is pure legend, and so on.
Pegando no calendário litúrgico e começando pelo dia 1 de janeiro, os bolandistas foram abrindo caminho em direção ao passado.
The first volume of January was published in 1643, and in 1924 we had arrived at the 10th of November.
We know we're never going to finish, not only because there are more and more saints, but also because what we discover about the saints, the things going around, give us other insights on the history of the Church and on what people thought and how things went on and so on.
Mas a abordagem histórica representada pelos bolandistas tornava o processo de canonização mais fácil ou apenas diferente. À medida que nos aproximamos do final de 20 séculos de cristianismo, a questão de quem merece ou não ser declarado santo permanece no ar. Veja-se o caso de uma mulher de política radical que fez um aborto e teve uma filha fora do casamento e continua a ser considerada por muitos a leiga católica mais influente deste século. Chamava-se Dorothy Day.
Dorothy Day was born in 1897 in Brooklyn, New York, to a family. Her father was a sports reporter, covered the racetrack beat. Her mother was a housewife, and her family was not religious at all. They moved to Chicago. And it was in Chicago, really, in her early teens, that Dorothy became aware that there was another side to life. And she wandered all the different neighborhoods of Chicago and had a sense, for the first time in her life, that the systems and society can cause tremendous problems.
Depois da faculdade, Dorothy mudou-se para Nova York e começou a trabalhar num jornal radical chamado The Call. O seu círculo de amigos, particularmente da esquerda, alargou-se.
So it was quite an interesting life she had, meeting people who went on to a lot of great positions in journalism and in Hollywood and playwrights and the like. She
All the while she was actually, during that time, trying to figure out where she belonged, what was going on. She had a number of great friendships, but deep within there was always a sense of the deep loneliness, the long loneliness, she called it.
Contudo, mesmo quando se empenhava mais profundamente na mudança social, a sua vida pessoal ia se tornando cada vez mais caótica. Teve uma série de amantes e ficou grávida de um deles.
She was deeply in love with him, but he took off and left. She went in to have an abortion at his urging, and this was a great depressive moment in her life.
Depois comprou uma casa em Staten Island e a sua vida começou a mudar.
There she met and fell in love with Forster Batterham, another anarchist, and they had a child together, Tamar. And when Tamar was born, she went up to a nun, Sister Aloysia, and said, "How could I have my baby baptized?" She'd been aware of Catholicism, but not aware of the beliefs, and certainly not practicing any kind of religion. But this impulse came to her, and in preparing her daughter for baptism, she decided she would become a Catholic. And so at this time when she found herself making a commitment to her faith, she said, now what's going to happen? And she actually knelt down and prayed and said, God, you have to send me an answer as to how I can use my talents and this passion that I have for the wretched masses and somewhere in my life. The next day, she met Peter Morin.
Morin era pregador itinerante francês, radical, que acreditava que as respostas para os problemas sociais só podiam ser encontradas no reino espiritual. A recém-convertida Dorothy Day sentiu que a perspectiva de Morin despertava algo nela. Decidiram concentrar todas as suas energias na publicação de um jornal radical católico. No dia 1 de maio de 1933, os primeiros exemplares do The Catholic Worker, o Operário Católico, chegaram às bancas. Foi o início do Movimento Operário Católico, uma organização dedicada ao serviço dos pobres, que combinava a paixão de Dorothy pelos desfavorecidos com a sua paixão pela fé. Este trabalho iria ocupá-la para o resto da vida e levaria muitos dos que a conheceram a descrevê-la como uma santa.
Wherever she went, she changed lives, and it wasn't what she said so much; it was in who she was. She was invited to speak all over the country in church halls and at different events and retreats, and she'd sit there and she'd have a cigarette going at all times. She'd sit there in kind of an offhanded manner, just begin to talk and tell life as she saw it. And as she saw it, really was the way the Gospels tell it. You know, we are not loving one another is not an option. If there's someone without a coat, and you have one in your closet, you got to find that person and give it to them. And this was not an option or a nice thing to be strived at. This is just the way things were.
Quase no final da vida, Dorothy Day concedeu várias entrevistas à televisão, as quais nos permitiram conhecer pouco a mulher que dia talvez venha a ser proclamada santa.
First became a Catholic because I felt that the Catholic Church was the church of the poor, and I still think it's the church of the poor. We're living in these times of a time of tremendous failure, of man's sense of responsibility for what he is doing. He relinquishes it to the state. He's not obedient to his own, the promptings of conscience.
Apesar de Dorothy Day não ter uma causa pendente no Vaticano, os seus apoiantes são cada vez mais.
Dorothy Day ought to be canonized because she's really a saint for our times. Oftentimes people think of saints as otherworldly, almost like fairy tale creatures. But the thing about Dorothy Day is she's a real woman who really lived in this century and struggled with the issues that a lot of 20th century Americans are facing. And the fact that she was able to find a path to holiness that incorporated a vision of justice for our future, I think is necessary.
Dorothy Day, as far as I know, has been a very remarkable personality, and I don't know why no proceedings were ever started in the diocese, but as I said already in the beginning, causes are not decreed from above. They do not come from here, they do not come from the bishop. There must be a popular movement for people who desire her beatification, and then it's up to the local authorities whether to proceed with the cause or not.
She made a terrible mistake. She wrote. There's an old rule in Rome, so if you want to be canonized, don't write anything. She wrote and talked and talked and talked. She loved it. So the body of her work that will have to be reviewed word by word. And some of the things she wrote were at variance with what was then considered, and even now considered, church teaching. I think they'll keep Dorothy on ice, if you'll pardon the expression, for at least another 50 years.
Sabemos que o processo de canonização é longo e complicado. Mas como é que realmente funciona? Como é que o vizinho caridoso passa de ir ao local a santo reconhecido pelos católicos de todo o mundo?
Here's the way it works right now. Right now is that, let's supposing Mrs. Jones dies, and a reputation develops among her friends, her neighbors, and so forth, that she really was a saint. She did extraordinary things for other people. And people, will start telling stories. And they might go to her gravesite, pray for her, and so forth, and ask favors and say, Mrs. Jones, you were my neighbor in life. Now, look, you're up there with God. You got to help me with my daughter who's prone to drugs and so forth.
For every cause, there has to be, first of all, a popular movement. That's to say, people who have known the candidate feel that he is worthy to be beatified and canonized. This must be not a movement restricted to a few people, thousands of people.
From a group saying, let's pray to that so-and-so will be recognized as a saint. And they'll ask to to collect stories of what they call divine favors or miracles received. I prayed to Mrs. Jones, and indeed, my sore knee healed, or whatever the case may be. And they collect these things. At a certain point, a bishop is of where the person died is to take notice of these and say, maybe there's something here. Now, he has to assemble the people to investigate this person's life. Mrs. Jones's letters, email, if it was a modern cause, talk to everybody. They would hold what they call tribunals. They would ask questions of people that knew Mrs. Jones, the children, the parent, all the rest. When they've gathered all this material and they think that they've got a good case that perhaps she may be a saint, they send it to Rome.
Nowadays, there is the postulator, who is the defendant of the cause. He presents the cause, but the congregation names a so-called relator, a superior judge. I have been one for 10 years. And he has to follow the presentation of the material, which of course has to be synthesized and presented according to certain norms.
When this is all prepared, it will go to a body of consultors.
It is a board of historians who examine whether everything is all right from the historical point of view. Then it goes to a board of 9 theologians who have to examine the thing on their part. Finally, it goes to 12 or 15 cardinals and bishops who still have to say.
If they support that decision, then it goes to the Pope, who usually goes along with the congregation. At that point, the person is declared heroically virtuous and is called a venerable.
Pierre Toussaint e Matt Talbot receberam ambos o título de venerável. O nosso último provável candidato a santo mostra bem como o processo de canonização tem mudado no decorrer dos últimos 2000 anos. Chamava-se Óscar Arnulfo Romero e era arcebispo de El Salvador. Este é o seu funeral. 3 dias antes, enquanto celebrava a missa, fora morto a tiro por um assassino desconhecido. Agora, o seu corpo estava exposto em câmara ardente e a sua morte era chorada por milhões dos seus conterrâneos, principalmente das classes mais baixas. Durante a maior parte deste século, os camponeses de El Salvador tiveram uma vida de privação quase medieval. Desigualdade na posse da terra, repressão política, atos de terrorismo, tudo isto foi imposto aos desfavorecidos deste devoto país católico. Ninguém falava em nome deles, até que surgiu o arcebispo Romero. A Igreja, disse ele uma vez, não nos separa do mundo, mas mergulha-nos nele.
En esa época, en El Salvador, la gente esperaba escuchar sus homilías. Me recuerdo que en mi casa en particular, esperábamos esa hora a las 10 de la mañana para poner el radio, escuchar sus homilías, porque era la única forma de información que se tenía en esa época.
Na noite antes de ser assassinado, leu publicamente os nomes das pessoas mortas pelo exército e milícias políticas. Depois, dirigiu-se aos militares do seu país. Peço-vos, disse ele, suplico-vos, ordeno-vos em nome de Deus, ponham fim à repressão. Em vez disso, foi assassinado. No dia 24 de março de 1980, enquanto celebrava a missa na capela de um hospital, uma bala disparada por um comando paramilitar desconhecido apagou a vida que Romero proporcionara ao seu povo.
Había una gran consternación por eso, por ese evento. Fue un momento de mucha tristeza, de mucho dolor. Pues se sentían como solas, como abandonadas, que el refugio había sido quitado de ellos. Y desde luego muchas personas desde un principio empezaron a rezar por él y a través de él.
O túmulo de Romero, no interior da velha Catedral de São Salvador, atrai peregrinos oriundos de toda a América Central. As pessoas rezavam-lhe e muitas afirmavam ter sido curadas por sua intercessão. Os relatos de milagres multiplicavam-se. Assim, desencadeou-se um movimento popular pela canonização do arcebispo Romero. Pelo menos aparentemente, Óscar Romero tem tudo para ser um candidato à santidade. Foi um mártir. São-lhe atribuídos milagres. E o povo de El Salvador venera a sua memória. Se tivesse vivido e morrido há 2000 anos, ter-se-ia tornado santo quase automaticamente, sem a interferência de Roma. Mas agora, as regras são diferentes.
Unfortunately, this present Pope is not of a mind to do it. He has replaced Romero, or at least Romero's successor, with an arch-conservative from Spain. I think it's going to be a good while. Rome will say the waiting period's 50 years anyway, so let's wait. Gets them off the hook.
It's a mixture between politics and ecclesiastical matters, and these causes are always very complex. One has to ascertain exactly what was the intention of the people who eventually gave the order to kill him or who killed him effectively.
Es un ejemplo para todos de cómo una persona humana, como tú y yo, puede llegar a alcanzar esa gran virtud, la virtud de la santidad, en la cual todos nosotros estamos llamados a ser santos. Él, en su forma, en su tiempo, en ese pueblo, el Señor lo llamó, lo escogió y él dijo sí.
Nos seus 2000 anos de história, a Igreja Católica canonizou mais de 10.000 santos, na sua maioria, homens e mulheres chamados a fazer um sacrifício heroico. Tiveram as origens mais variadas e seguiram caminhos diferentes para a santidade. E se as causas de Oscar Romero, Pierre Toussaint, Dorothy Day e Matt Talbot nunca alcançarem a canonização, quem poderá dizer que eles não são já santos? Afinal, há sempre um Tribunal Supremo.
Oh, when the saints go marching in, oh, when the saints go marching in, I tell you what I want to be. I want to be, I tell you I want to be in that number. When the saints, oh, when the saints, oh, when the saints, oh, when the saints go marching in. Oh, when the saints go marching in, I want to be in the number. I want to march on it. Oh, oh, when the saints go marching in, I want to be in the number. I want to march on it. Oh, oh, when the saints go marching in, I want to be in the number. I want to march on it. Oh, oh, when the saints go marching in, I want to be in the number. I want to march on.